Hey everyone, DM Pie Guy here again. So today I'm coming at you with something a little bit different. John from Laidback D&D, DM John, has asked me, and along with some collaboration from him, to put out a series of videos kind of introducing you guys into AD&D, or essentially how I'm taking this is all old school formats. So I think I'm going to break this up into a series of several videos. This first one, I'm going to go over some general philosophical differences between modern gaming and old school gaming. Kind of like what you need to know as a player coming to the table to an old school game for the first time. Then later on, we're going to get into some interesting stuff like the different character classes, some inventory stuff, and then like how to even run a little bit of a combat and some common tactics that were employed that might not be super obvious. All that stuff John thinks is going to help our games go a lot more smoothly, and I would agree with that, because it's a totally different ballpark, old school versus modern. And if you've never stepped into that world before, you might be a little bit lost. So hopefully I'll be able to help guide you through what you need to have in order to really get the most out of your game. So right here, we're looking at the AD&D Player's Handbook. I spent hours of my time looking at this cover, as well as then, I'll reveal my little hand here, this DM screen. This was my childhood. And I think a lot of people will immediately recognize it, even if you don't play old school games, just because it's that iconic. So the thing that I wanted to call out and why I have this as my backdrop for this video is that old school was not necessarily a high fantasy game. It started out a lot lower fantasy. You were just normal dudes that were going into a dungeon. How I have it written down and how I believe it really was is you were braver than average farmers to start out with, and then you finally started to become something extraordinary towards the end of the game once you got some levels. You were then basically like the shepherds of men. So in this artwork, you can really see that pulp fantasy roots that D&D had. You have these guys that are climbing up here to try and get out these huge gemstone eyes, which is a big gameplay loop for all old school games, is delving into dungeons and finding treasure. You have guys here that they're trying to figure out where they go next. They're clearly kind of lost, or they're wondering if they should double back and do something else. And then you have these guys that have just engaged in some combat with a big lizard man or something there. Just very quintessential D&D. So, to my first point, and I think that a lot of the art really depicts this very well, is that you are a small person in the world. Your character is very fragile. You can't approach it like a 5e game where your character is going to be nearly invincible and starts out pretty much as a hero. Because while you are heroic in old school games, you can die basically in any combat. All it takes is a couple bad dice rolls and you're gone. So the other thing that I want to point out from this artwork here is that the world is kind of everything in old school games. It's not so much about focusing on the party specifically. It's about everything that's going on around the party too. So here in this one, we just have this beautiful collage of all of this stuff. Like you've got guys that are getting treasure, dragons, knights fighting here. These people that they look just gritty, realistic. And that's really like the feeling that you get from playing one of these games. And I really love it. I think that if you can get into that mentality, you'll really love it too. But you just have to come to the table understanding that characters are going to die. A TPK might happen, but you need to understand the game doesn't end there. You're going to pick it back up next week, you're going to re-roll characters, and keep going. The story doesn't stop. Next big difference is the dungeon for old schools really is the game. You're going to spend like 75 to 80% of your time in a dungeon. That's just how it is. They're not these little dungeons that 5e has where they're kind of like 5 rooms and then you get out and you go back to do the real game. No, like these are like 30, 40, 100 room dungeons with 5, 6 floors sometimes, and they have a layout that is basically ubiquitous across most design, where your objective is always down. The other thing that is very common amongst dungeons is that you're going to have rooms that are pointless. They're there just to tax your resources, and part of your job is to find out which one you really need to investigate, which ones you don't need to investigate, and which ones will give you treasure, because that's one of your ultimate goals, is to get richer so that you can progress your character. The next big thing that you need to know is you cannot rely on the dice. If you rely on the dice, you have a very high chance of failure at the beginning. A level 1 character does not have good odds of succeeding on their skills. So thieves have a table of skills here. And if you say, I'm looking for traps, you have to roll under 25% to be able to find traps. That's not very good odds. The story that John loves to tell people, and it's a pretty good example, is the flour trick. So an old school player will say, hey, I've got flour in my rations. I'm going to take a handful out. I'm going to throw it over the hallway. And I'm going to see if that flour lands on a tripwire and it powders it. And so then the DM might say, okay, yeah, that's reasonable. I think that's pretty realistic. And you see, lo and behold, there's a tripwire there. Okay, well, then I step over the tripwire. No rolls involved. That is very important for this type of game. The next thing is that you have to understand the DM. This game is DM facing. 5e and even more so, 3.5 was very player facing, where the players knew what they were going to be up for. They knew all the rules. In AD&D, it's not really like that. The DM controls everything. If they believe a situation's realistic, they can say, yep, you succeed. If they say, I don't really think that your ability should apply here, your ability doesn't apply there. That's just how it was. That's how you'll need to accept it being. So to my point that you want to get creative with it. This here is another example of AD&D artwork where you have a party fighting a monster. You kind of have all of these people trying to gang up on this big guy who, he looks like he's having a little bit of a bad time, but trust me, he's also probably able to kill any of these people. You need to take tactical advantages. That is very important. We'll go over that more so in another video where I'll actually get into some combat tactics, but just understand that be looking for any advantage you can get. Here is the thief artwork from the AD&D module. I really love this picture. I spent a lot of time on this page just for that chart. I thought that was a good thing to tie to my last point here, which is AD&D, even though it's DM facing, is player driven. A DM cannot drag a party through a dungeon. It just will not be a good time for anyone involved. So, as a player, what you need to do is you need to be active. You need to be paying attention and engaged to what's going on. If the DM has to explain a hallway 4 or 5 times, it's going to get really old. And you're probably not going to enjoy it very much if you miss what is happening. The other thing is you need to get creative. So you need to think outside the box and understand that anything goes in AD&D pretty much. If you want to try just some crazy off-the-wall plan, understand it might fail, but you can certainly try it. And then the last thing that I want to bring up is that teamwork is essential in all old school games. You need to strategize with your party before going into encounters. The reason for this is because there's sort of a certain way that things are done. Missile fire goes first, and then movement, and then melee. So you want to have people stay back so then the missile fire can go off, and then on the next turn they'll move into melee to then keep those people from getting to the missile fire, who then are going to pick up different actions. Stuff like that. But you need to strategize with your teammates, or it's going to be a very bad time. Because any unoptimal actions where people are forced to basically sit their turns out, it's going to result in very lopsided fights for the enemies. The last thing that I want to leave you with is that the more you put into the game, the more you get out in the terms of developing goals. So you'll be getting kind of these nebulous incentives, like you'll get gold, you'll get magic items and stuff, and all of that stuff is super rewarding, it's fun, give you a good dopamine hit, but then you have to think about what do you want to actually do with it. So one of the most fun aspects for me of AD&D is that you can take that money back and you can build strongholds, you can get followers, henchmen, you can sort of make your own little story, carve out your own niche in the world, and that is just super rewarding. I think that if you guys take some of the advice that I'm going to give in these videos, that you'll have a great time, and I'm super excited to share this hobby with you guys. Alright, I'll see you on the next one, guys.